Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
So we're going to have to turn these on. Yeah, they'll turn red.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kenneth McCall, pharmacist and board member for the Partnership for Safe Medicines. Welcome to our annual congressional briefing on counterfeit drugs in America. Our organization, PSM, is 16 years old this year. We are a coalition of more than 70 groups, patient advocate organizations, healthcare professionals, wholesalers, and manufacturers that are concerned about the danger of counterfeit medicine to American patients. We're unique because we bring together groups that often wouldn't agree on much else if you polled them. But they all agree that counterfeits are a clear, present, and growing danger to Americans, and that we should be tightening the supply chain and not loosening it. If you'd like to join us, please see our executive director, Shabbir Safdar, after the event. You can also find us at safemedicines.org, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. This year, 22 of our member organizations felt strongly enough about the counterfeit drug threat that they asked to be our partners in this briefing. You'll find all 22 of those partners listed on the vertical banner to my right. Thank you. Thanks to the list of partners listed on that screen, we recognize and appreciate their assistance. In September 2017, the partnership released a report which tallied publicly reported instances of counterfeit pills made with fentanyl and its analogs. At that time, in 2017, 40 states had seized these deadly pills, and 16 states had reported that residents had died after taking them. By last year's congressional briefing, that number had risen to 43 states reporting counterfeit pills, 22 of them with documented fatalities. Today, fake prescription pills have been found in 46 states and have killed people in 29 of them. To be clear, there are only 4 states in the Union that have not found fake prescription pills made with illegally imported fentanyl. These pills look exactly like real Xanax, oxycodone, and other prescription medicines. The people who take them often believe that they are taking the same dose as a genuine prescription pill. But these fakes are manufactured badly, often with so much fentanyl that a single pill is fatal. One of the most frightening things about this situation is that a large portion of these counterfeit pills, or the equipment and drugs to make them, come to the U.S. the way other counterfeit prescriptions come, in the mail. And because they come in the mail, often with deceptive packaging, they're very difficult to catch at the border. Today, you'll hear from a victim of counterfeit drugs and families who have lost loved ones to counterfeit drugs. You'll hear from law enforcement officers fighting these drugs in your communities, and from agents who have battled international organized crime to stop them coming over the border. As they tell their stories, please consider the actions you can take to help protect our citizens from harm. Help educate Americans about the deadly risks of counterfeit prescription drugs. Support the law enforcement entities at the federal, state, and local level in their quest to take these products off our streets, sometimes at great risk to themselves. Protect our closed drug supply by supporting policies that tighten its security and never relax our standards through proposals like importing non-FDA approved medicines. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to our first panel and Shabbir Safdar.
Thank you, Mac.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I do appreciate that lunch is a great draw. But I appreciate your time. Time is valuable, and we've assembled a great deal of valuable experts and information for you. This first panel is going to be families who have lost family members to counterfeits and one survivor, which is a pretty rare occurrence. The important thing that I want to make sure that we all understand is that once counterfeits enter the supply chain, wherever they are in this country, they are a threat to everyone. It isn't as if someone makes a fake Xanax and it's over there with some set of people that we don't identify with. At the point at which there is a fake, perfect-looking medication with a fatal amount of fentanyl in it, everyone is at risk. And these stories today will help show that. Let me introduce first Carrie Luther. And I'm just going to sort of launch into it. Carrie, would someone, thank you, click the slide. Tell us about your experience and your son Tosh.
So my son Tosh was just, a ordinary 29-year-old deciding what to do next in his life and figuring out where to go and what career to pursue and those kinds of things. And he was a very kind soul. Everybody who knew Tosh knew him to be a loyal friend and family member and coworker, and I don't think he had an enemy on the earth. And he was very easygoing and goofy and fun and just really authentic and genuine. And we would have the best talks, about girls and God and baseball. We loved baseball together. We spent a lot of time talking about baseball and his work and, again, his career and girls. And so he was just a great guy. You would have loved him. And then, I don't know if you want me to launch right into what happened.
Yeah. How did he counter a counterfeit?
Yeah, so one afternoon, he and his friends went to the beach just to hang out on a beautiful day in October in California. That's where we're from. And at the end of the day, he headed home. It was about 10:30, and called his girlfriend like he often did at the end of a day, and they talked for a while. And then they hung up, and he had been suffering from a terrible case of hives for about 6 weeks, and he was seeing a doctor to try to figure out what was causing what allergy was causing these hives. And so he was itching really badly, and he was taking Benadryl for that. And he had obtained a Xanax from an acquaintance that he trusted, not somebody unknown on the street. And so he talked to his girlfriend, and then he called her back a little while later because he was so uncomfortable from his hives, and he just couldn't go to sleep. So she said everything else sounded completely normal, nothing out of the ordinary. So they talked for about an hour and probably hung up around 2:30, she thinks. And they agreed at the end of their call that he would call her by 11 o'clock the next morning so they could go do something together. Well, 11 o'clock came and went, and 11:30 and 12 o'clock, and she didn't hear from him. So she started calling him, and he didn't answer his phone repeatedly. And as a young woman might, she was getting annoyed, thinking he'd stood her up. And so she decided after a little while, something's wrong. That's not like Tosh. So she drove to his house, and his car was parked in the driveway. And she went in the house and tried to open his bedroom door, and it was locked. And she said that wasn't even unusual for him. So she went around to the back of the house and looked through his bedroom window and could see him lying on his bed on his stomach. So she went back inside, was able to get the door unlocked somehow, and walked over to him and put her hand on his shoulder to just jostle him, and he was cold. to the touch. So she rolled him over, and his lips were blue. And he'd vomited on his pillow. I'm okay, it's okay. This is the reality of it. So she called 911 and got him on the floor and started CPR. And the paramedics came. It took them about 20 minutes to get there because he lived way up in the hills on a beautiful piece of property with his dad. And they took over and did everything they could, but it was hours too late. So what I learned 9 days later from the coroner that did the investigation and only found blister packs of Benadryl in his room for the itching and 1 Motrin bottle. And they took that, and inside they found 3/4 of a Xanax bar remaining. So you heard a moment ago that 1 pill could be enough to kill you. But in my son's case, it was 1/4 of a pill. And he died probably immediately after he took that pill after talking to his girlfriend so he could sleep. That's the only reason he took it, was to sleep. He had no idea. And I've seen the remaining 3/4 of that pill, and you can't tell that it's counterfeit. Only a trained eye could tell that it's counterfeit. And I don't know about you, but I don't look that closely at prescription medications that I'm taking.
You know, I feel like we as Americans are not, it's almost like we're unimmunized to the danger of counterfeits because our legal supply chain is so safe. Have you, Tosh it was a childhood friend that gave Tosh this medication.
I wouldn't say childhood friend, but he was a friend. I mean, he was he was long enough where Tosh trusted him. And I've heard that, you know, that everybody in our community in that age group knew this young man. He went to the same high school that my son went to.
Did this experience change the way that you behaved with friends and family and medication?
Yeah, well, interestingly, the day after I learned how he died at the reception following his service, his celebration of life service, a very long-time friend of mine's wife was there, and she approached me, you know, and put her hand on my shoulder and said, "How you doing, Carrie? You holding up okay? Do you need something?" And held out her hand, and there were a number of different pills in her hand, and one of them was Xanax. Now, she couldn't have known that that's how he died, because I just learned myself the day before, but it just alarmed me. And just the realization that we do that. We share our medications with one another and thinking we're being helpful. And you just don't know where, unless you know it came from a brick and mortar pharmacy, you can't know where the origin of that medication came from. And that's what has changed for me. And I tell everybody that I speak to a lot of junior high and high school kids. I do a lot of speaking with Shabbir. That's the message you have to spread to everyone you know, is you can't take anything that you didn't get yourself from a brick and mortar pharmacy. It's too risky.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Kristen and Caroline, after that story, can you tell us about your sister Maggie? What was she like?
So there were 4 of us kids growing up. We were all very, very close. Although one thing I've not mentioned, just to give some context, is she was much, much shorter than the rest of us. So she was always a little different. But she was really just the kindest person. And even within our family, she was kind of known as like the neutralizer. So when we would be arguing or something, she always smoothed it out, and no one ever really argued with her. But she was just a great person, and we grew up together. We went to college together. They shared a room by choice growing up. And then when she was older, which I can just kind of segue into what happened with, she ended up moving to Florida. She became an Outback Steakhouse restaurant manager, and she loved it. She and her husband made it clear they were never moving back to the Northeast. They didn't want to see snow anymore. They were really happy there. So she got transferred to a new store, and it was her first day on the job, and she was stocking the bar, putting away the liquor, and she threw her back out. And she was kind of like in a panic about being able to go back for the next day, being brand new and in charge. Both Caroline and I talked, and our brother as well, talked to her that day, see how she was feeling and everything. And she purchased an oxycodone pill from her coworker, who was also her friend outside of work, so someone she trusted as well. And she took half of it that evening and died almost immediately.
And how did you find out? Who got the call?
My sister's husband called me around 11 o'clock at night that night, and it was typical that he would call me if they got into like little arguments or just, you know, to shoot the breeze. And so I was tired and I didn't answer, and he called right back, and I just like knew, you know, I had that gut instinct. And when I answered, he said, Cara, your sister died. I mean, just like that. So I was in shock, and I didn't really truly understand that she was already dead. Like, I thought maybe he had just walked in and thought she was dead. So I wasn't as panicked as you would necessarily think. I thought there was still probably a solution to this other than her being deceased. But time had passed since before he called us. He came home from work. Maggie had hurt her back the day before, so she was relaxing, and he went into their bedroom and to check on her, and she got up. And she stood up and she said, you want to go get something to eat? I'm hungry. And he goes, I feel bad you hurt your back. She goes, no, I could use it. Let's get out of the house. We'll pick up pizza or fast food, something easy so we don't have to cook. And he said, no problem. She goes, I'm just going to shower. I've been laying down all day. And he went downstairs. He changed the laundry. He sat down on the couch, turned on the 10 o'clock news. He said he looked at the clock. It was like 10:10. He's like, that's strange. We went upstairs and she was dead. She was already dead from the conversation that they had 15 minutes prior to dead, where same thing as your when they called she didn't even go to the hospital. She never went to the hospital. They took her out of her apartment in front of her husband in a body bag. It was instant, her succumbing to that counterfeit medication.
Your case is really quite unique in that you actually got to see and have an investigation chase down the man who actually made this pill. Mm-hmm. It's not usually the case. Can you tell us about that?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I'll just start with where I ended all the time. That it was the DEA and the prosecutor's office. It was exceptional. She died in September of 2016, and we didn't know the cause of death until December of that year. But we'll find out later in October, the DEA got involved, and they worked, tirelessly for about a whole year on this case, and they were able to, they went to her coworker who she got the pill from. He, of course, was beside himself, so he worked with and to be honest, they had him, like, in a hard, position but he cooperated with them. He said who he had gotten it from, and this person actually was the son of an office manager at a doctor's office. And he had been working, this person was a spine surgeon in Florida who was making these fake pills. So he was writing prescriptions, having people fill them, bring them back to him, and then he had ordered online fentanyl, a pill press, and other components, and he was cutting the pills and remaking fake pills for distribution.
With fentanyl.
Yep. So he actually was sentenced to jail in April. He was sentenced in July. We had the chance, all of us, our brother, my parents, my husband, to fly down there and give our victim impact statements and really just, explain in small part of the devastation that this has caused.
When I look at some of the foreign counterfeiters that are so hard to bring to justice, people who got brought to a plea bargain with no jail time last summer from Canada Drugs, the licensed wholesaler that was involved in counterfeit cancer medication, and they didn't even have to do any jail time. It's comforting to know that at least in your case, this guy is in jail for the rest of his life. even though he was trying to flee at the time.
Right, I just wanted to mention that as well. When he was arrested, it was at the airport, headed towards Philadelphia with 4,000 pills in a bag in his luggage. So his intention was certainly not, oh, wow, someone died, I'd better stop this or reformulate even or something. It was, let me just get it out of Florida so the traceability is not there, and it would, so.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's difficult, I know. So, Rick, your story is also difficult, but you are a very unique person in that you're able to tell us about what you went through. So, give us an intro.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Rick Roberts. I teach at the University of San Francisco, and that's, I guess, where this all begins to explain what happened. So, I was an undergrad the early 80s at USF. It was an amazing time to be in San Francisco. Little did we know what was really going on. And in 1984, HIV was discovered, and at that point, many of us had already been infected, including myself. And so in 1988, I was diagnosed with AIDS. Treatment options were very limited, very few medicines available. I made it through the 80s, expecting not to have more than about 24 months. So I got to the 90s, and there were lots of ups and downs. And in 2000, I was diagnosed with a condition that required the injection of human growth hormone on a daily basis. And I was approved for a 6-month supply. And the medicine, when I would go to the pharmacy, came in 2 little bottles each dose. So there was a little bottle of sterile water and a little bottle of just white powder. And I would mix the 2 and inject it. And I did that every day, and about halfway through my year of injecting it, there was a change. It started stinging when I would inject it, and I thought that was odd, because it would sting until the next day, and that hadn't happened before, and I'd been on this drug for a while, and I thought I should ask my pharmacist about this. I didn't have much of an immune system. I was looking for infections, not finding anything, and so I didn't really understand what was going on, except it was the holidays. It was really busy, and so I just ran into my pharmacy. This is a brick and mortar pharmacy in my neighborhood, and ran in and got my next refill and went home, and later started taking that, and the stinging went away. So I was really relieved that I didn't have that stinging to deal with anymore. But the water bottle had different amounts of water. It was usually just exactly 1 cc, and this time it had a little bit more, a little bit less, and I thought, well, that's really sloppy manufacturing. Like, I don't know what's wrong with them. But the next time I went to my pharmacy, I asked for the pharmacist, and he came out, and I said, hey, look, I had this stinging, and now there's not enough water in some of the vials. And he just looked at me and said, well, you should go home and check. You may have gotten some of the fake stuff. And I had no idea what that meant. And I must have looked surprised. And he said, well, we sent back what we had on the shelves, but it probably got to some people. You may be one of them. You should go home and check. So I went home, and I looked at the boxes of medicine that I just got in the vials and my old boxes. And because I'm lazy, I didn't throw one of my old boxes away. So I pulled that out and compared them. And they were perfect, laser printed, identical, except the label on the powder bottle had the degree sign missing from one of the numbers. Like, you know how it'll say stored under this to this? When I looked really closely, the degree sign was missing, but that was the only difference I really found. And then in another box, so I found another difference, that the blue ink was slightly darker when I compared it to the boxes I just received, but only when I had 2 boxes to put together. There's no way you would notice this change. So I realized that I had 3 different sets of things in front of me, assuming one was real, that 2 of those sets must be counterfeit. And as it turned out, I received 2 different counterfeits of the same medicine 2 months in a row, created by 2 different sets of bad actors. I mean, I don't know what the odds are of that, but 2 months in a row, these bad actors. And so I was later able to go to my doctor a few days later, and she yelled out loud and said, we know you didn't get the medicine you needed, but what did you put in your body? we need to know right now what you were injecting for the last 2 months. Because I said, I think there were different things. And for 1 month it was this, 1 month was that. And she's like, we need to know what you did to yourself by injecting this. And because it was an ongoing investigation, and because the FDA and people didn't even know for a long time, it took a long time to analyze and figure it out, there were 3 really terrible months where I had no idea what I injected myself with or what would be happening as a result of that. I had a lot of nightmares and found it hard to function sometimes. I would just get really obsessed with not knowing. I found out that the first batch was human chorionic gonadotropin. It's the hormone that women make when they're pregnant. It's the basis of the pregnancy test. Not something that I should have been injecting. It's used as a part of a cycle for fertility, but not in men. And as I explained earlier, it does explain why I would suddenly burst into tears during Hallmark commercials. I was injecting this hormone for a month. And then the second batch of counterfeits, based on the foreign contaminants, they know that it was produced somewhere overseas. They were able to trace at least how my counterfeit traveled through the secondary distribution chain to get to my pharmacy. And I was able to testify against 2 of the people. I thought I was just over it until I saw these bad guys walk into the room, and I knew they had just done this for money, and not just to me. They didn't care that I didn't get my medicine. They didn't care what happened as a result of me taking the fake medicine. And their only supplier was a company in Florida called Reckitt. Knowing this and experiencing this, I take 21 prescriptions a day. I go to my pharmacy every month. I took over 10,000 pills last year. And now I'm on insulin with an insulin pump. Insulin is the thing that I focus on. Now, I always check all my pills before I leave the counter, which is a lot of pills, and I take a lot of time, and I know people have to line up and wait for me. But I'm not going to leave without checking every single bottle. But the insulin is simply a vial with a clear liquid in it. There's no way for me to know if it's somehow any different. And it takes me back to the sting operation in Florida, where they handled one of my counterfeits, because they found, along with about $1 million worth of counterfeits that were about to be distributed when they did the sting, hundreds and hundreds of units of insulin in the Florida sun, just sitting in the sun ready for distribution. And now whenever I go to the pharmacy, I have to wonder when I pick up those vials of clear liquid.
Well, you are one of the earliest counterfeit stories that I've helped learn about and document, and I'm grateful that the bricks and mortar supply chain is much better today than it was then. But I'm still reminded, as we have incidences of entities like Canada Drugs and others that get caught with sometimes even legal medication, but has not been kept in temperature-controlled manners. It's one of the things that when Minnesota was doing an importation program, Governor Pawlenty's inspectors went to Canada and found cold chain drugs not kept cold chain. And so even when you have the right medication, if you are not regulated well enough to be afraid of not making that kind of mistake, you can endanger patients. When you now, as a patient who requires certain therapies to live, like the HIV drug cocktail, when you think about someone messing with or maybe cutting a little bit of a corner on safety to achieve a price access issue, what do you think? I mean, what does that mean for you that maybe once you would get a counterfeit if they were to tell you that, oh, well, next time we'll get it from a better place?
Well, the insulin, I think of my pump is calibrated by my doctor on a certain dose. And if I'm putting fake stuff, the doctor's immediately going to think I just need higher doses and reprogram my pump. And what happens then when I put real insulin in that pump? And with HIV, you may be aware that people need to take a cocktail of drugs, at least 3 drugs from 2 classes to maintain the mutations of the virus so that it can't replicate. And if you have a subtherapeutic dose or missing a complete dose of one of those, the virus can then mutate and you will become resistant to those drugs. And then you can no longer use them. You have to cross those off your treatment option list. And there's a finite number of drugs that you can use. And those drugs now become impossible to use again for therapy, and narrow down your options.
So those medicines, the virus would become immune to therapy by those medicines, and you can never use them for the rest of your life.
No, those mutations are there in the virus, and at least that's my experience. I've had to cross a few off for other reasons, and once the virus is resistant to that drug, you can't go back.
Well, Carrie, Caroline, and Kristen, do you have things that you have that you would like to say from this experience that have struck you that about how you view the world differently now?
Wow, that's a big question. You know, my whole life has changed, and what I've learned about this in the 2.5 years I've been doing this is you don't have to be an addict to die from taking a counterfeit medication. And that's the message, because there's this misunderstanding that it's all the opioid crisis, and it's not. My son wasn't an opioid addict. He took his Xanax because he wanted to sleep. And that's an important lesson that everyone needs to hear, because it could happen to anyone in any demographic, economically, social, class, whatever. You could just be an ordinary person like my son and die from a counterfeit medication. You know, no one should have to feel like they have to risk that. And that's just, now I'm on edge about that. You know, every person I come in contact with, when the door opens for me to tell my son's story, I'm telling it. And wherever I am, I'm telling it.
Well, thank you. Any last words?
Similar to what Carrie was saying, you know, when you lose someone suddenly and so close to you, an initial reaction is anger. At least it was for me. And when I came across Shabbir and this organization, it is a positive way to channel all the emotions, because there's only so much you can go without. They have to come out somehow, and it's not always a positive way. And this is a positive way for them to come out, and every person who knows is another person. So all the people in here, I'm sure, will tell at least one other person what you heard today, so we're doubling it. And you know, I'm annoying. Like, I tell people at work to tell their kids in college, to tell their friends, to tell their sorority sisters. Like, I tell everyone, because I'm only 34 and I was in college, you know, 12 years ago, and this didn't exist like it does now. And that's in 12 years. So every year it's getting worse, and it's getting more prevalent, and it's scary. And so I feel that, not that I'm saving the world, but just by telling people and getting the word out there and how easy it is. And like she said, you don't have to be an addict. You know, you can just be a regular college kid who's trying to go to sleep because you're itchy, and it can affect anyone.
Well, we thank you for your extremely emotional contribution and difficult stories to tell. Up next, we'll have two panels where law enforcement will talk about the kinds of crimes and that they've been pursuing and the measures that they take, and we're looking forward to that. Let's let the next panel, led by Sven, come up, and thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you for making the time to be here. This is a rather important topic. It's also one of those topics, no matter how often I hear it, no matter how often I work it, it always does take my breath. I have a 9 and 11-year-old daughter, and as they said very much, just as a father, it does concern me. Counterfeit drugs have been and are a lucrative business for illicit actors and criminal organizations, and they take advantage of loopholes, regulatory and enforcement loopholes, and they reap illicit profits from selling these dangerous drugs to consumers and patients. Often, a single picture speaks more than 1,000 words. So, let's see if I can do the technology here. FDA Commissioner Gottlieb, during the shutdown, wanted to make sure that people knew that the FDA was focused on mission critical and was making sure that consumers stay safe. Within 1 week, at one airport, the FDA OCI seized 1/2 ton of counterfeit drugs. That is 1 week at one airport. And in 2016, this counterfeit issue became even more dangerous. We saw the deadly advent of fentanyl-laced counterfeit drugs, and these dangerous counterfeits include a wide variety of opioids, as well as fentanyl-laced counterfeit Xanax drugs. And these dangerous drugs have now spread to 46 states, with death resulting in 29 of them. This concerning increase was also highlighted by the DEA in their 2018 National Threat Assessment Report. The DEA in their report highlighted in particular that increasingly selling fentanyl in the form of counterfeit prescription pills is occurring, and that criminals are adjusting their supplies in an attempt to circumvent new regulations. Furthermore, the increasing availability and use of fentanyl-containing counterfeit pills demonstrate a relationship with sudden outbreaks of overdose death. And when we look towards what the overdose numbers are now doing in the United States, this correlation between fentanyl and the strong increase in fentanyl overdoses cannot be overstated. So with this, I want to welcome our panel. I'm going to introduce them in a second, because these drugs not only cause a lot of human harm, but they also result in significant challenges to law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. We have a great panel here today to help us explore the challenges counterfeit drugs provide and help us understand the impact that drug importation could have. So let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Deputy Assistant Administrator Keith Brown from the Drug Enforcement Administration. He is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Diversion Control Division of the DEA headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. In his role, Mr. Brown is heavily engaged in various programs at DEA that have a direct impact on the opioid drug crisis in the United States. In particular, in the development of policies and regulations, the identification and scheduling of dangerous new controlled substances, and in outreach and training. Mr. Brown has been a special agent with the DEA since 1995. He has served in Texas, Tennessee, New Mexico, Louisiana, the DEA Special Operations Division, and DEA headquarters. Sheriff Keith Cain joins us today from Daviess County, Kentucky, where he has served the Daviess County Sheriff's Office since 1974 in various capacities, including Patrol Deputy, Chief Deputy, and Chief of Investigations. His work experience includes extensive narcotics investigations, both in an undercover capacity as well as a case investigator. Sheriff Cain serves in various leadership roles for the National Sheriff's Association. He is a member of the Board of Directors and the Chairman of the Drug Enforcement Committee. Most recently, he was elected to be the Executive Committee of the National Sheriff's Association. And lastly, today with us we have Executive Director Daniel Salter, who joined us today from Atlanta, Georgia. Executive Director Daniel Salter served as a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 31 years. For 6 of those years, he was the special agent in charge of the Atlanta and Dallas DEA offices. Following his service with the DEA, he was selected to serve as the Executive Director for the Atlanta, Carolinas High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, also known as HIDTA. HIDTA is an administered grant program through the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, of the Executive Office of the President. Executive Director Salter is responsible for HIDTA's mission to reduce drug trafficking and protection for the states of Georgia, North and South Carolina. Please help me welcome the panel. All right, shall we? Off we go. So we're gonna go over kind of a couple of separate areas, and I'm gonna start off with you, Executive Director Salter. Talk to us like at a higher level about what do you see as far as counterfeit opioid trends nationally? What other drugs do you see? Is it opioid focused? Is it more benzo focused? And with that, what are the biggest issues that you are seeing for HIDTA and across the law enforcement partners you work with?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I can't start this without, oftentimes when we talk, we're not considered, you look at victims, you look at the panels here before us, and those are the people that have had a real impact. And we in law enforcement community, I can speak on behalf of federal, state, and local. We're in your communities too. We have family and loved ones that are hurting, and oftentimes it's almost like two camps. And you hear the stories of DEA successfully prosecuting a scumbag doctor that was operating. That makes us feel good. So we're proud to partner with victims, and we're proud to partner with guys we're going to talk about on the next panel on the international level. But I have to always put that little plug in there because law enforcement, oftentimes we're dehumanized. We are humans. We recognize that this is an impact that's impacting our communities, the communities that you represent. And nobody, as was mentioned, these drugs don't discriminate. They kill everyone. And so with that, you ask about our biggest threat is obviously the introduction of fentanyl in the opiates, in the counterfeiting of these drugs, primarily by Mexican drug cartels that are shipping it to this country. We have to recognize that these things, these imitation drugs, look very similar to what you would get from your prescription doctor, through a prescription by your doctor, and it's to the naked eye. Professionals can't tell the difference. It has to be sent to a lab, and they're determined as a counterfeit. And ultimately, you see what happens. And I mentioned earlier, these cartel members that are mixing this fentanyl and press them into pills. These are idiots in some garage in Mexico that are stamping these things and bringing them over, and they look very similar to what we see prescribed. So it is a significant, as we said, it's a clear and present danger.
Oh, I appreciate that. Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown, let me get the next question to you. As I mentioned in the introductory remarks, the DEA in their 2018 Drug Threat Assessment Report has highlighted the issue of counterfeit opioids in its various facets. Can you highlight to us kind of really how do these drugs get here? Like how do they, is it sea cargo, is it air cargo? How do they get here? How do they penetrate the border? And what countries do we see them coming from?
First, thanks for being here. And like echo Dan, I want to thank the previous panel. That's tough to do what you do. I always, you watch these TV shows about law enforcement, all that. It's like, we don't take it personal. I tell people all the time that come to work for me, I don't want you if you don't take it personal. Go sell cars. Go do something else. If you don't take this job personal, you're not going to be good at it. You're not going to be effective at it. I really don't want you. So I thanks the previous panel. How does it get here? All of the above. Fentanyl, one of the reasons it's so dangerous is it's so dangerous in so small an amounts that a kilogram of fentanyl, it can produce thousands of doses of fentanyl. Thousands. A lot of times, most fentanyl products come from China. They are generally smuggled here in parcel services or to South America or Central America or Mexico. Those are sometimes in container shipping, but generally it comes to here in parcel services. And I used to work in Memphis to get an idea of it. The FedEx World Headquarters is in Memphis, Tennessee. And I used to go out there because we actually had a lot of business interaction with FedEx. And they have 2.5 million packages a night that flow through that facility in 4 hours. And that's one facility of one company. And so it gives you an idea of the scope of the problem. We have counterfeit pills manufactured in the United States. Somebody decides they want to be rich. A doctor from Florida is an example. I'm going to get a tabling machine, I'm going to get some fentanyl, and I'm going to start making money, because that's what this is all about, is making money. The organizations in Mexico, a little more sophisticated, they're even now buying the chemicals to make fentanyl. They get fentanyl, they get bigger tabling machines, they get more sophisticated punches and dyes that produce the pills to really counterfeit them, and then they smuggle them across the border like they smuggle every other drug they make. And you're going to have some guys later tell you what life south of the border is like, because they've lived it. That's the cartels are at the heart of the non-prescription opioid problem, and they remain at the heart because at the end of the day, they're here to make dollars. Never forget, drug trafficking is capitalism unfettered, uncontrolled, unregulated, don't care the cost, don't care how many people it kills, how many laws I break, quality control, none of that matters. If I can make $1, we're going to do it. And they're making lots of dollars. So.
Well, I appreciate it, especially the aspect of the mail ports was interesting. I'll follow up on that a little later, but it kind of reiterates the picture I showed from Commissioner Gottlieb. That was JFK mail port facility, the largest one in the nation, who the same receives millions of packages a day that they have to screen, hopefully, to the best of their ability. I want to move on to Sheriff Cain. Sheriff Cain, as the chair of the NSA's Drug Enforcement Committee, you have a very unique perspective because you work with all levels of law enforcement, federal, state, local. Talk to me about two perspectives. One of them is from the Drug Enforcement Committee perspective. What do you see as the issues stopping those countries from coming into the country? And then second piece is, talk to me a little bit about once these drugs are not stopped at the border, what local issues does that create?
Sure. I am here representing the National Sheriff's Association, which represents some 3,200 sheriffs across this nation. And I will tell you folks, to be totally honest and candid with you, to get 3,200 sheriffs to agree on anything is a magnanimous task. It's almost impossible. But one thing that we are uniform and undivided on is the issue that we're talking to you about today. The NSA has actually been monitoring this situation for the better part of about 2 or 3 years now, particularly as it relates to the opioid crisis. You'll hear a lot about that today because of the impact that it's having of these counterfeit drugs being laced with this poison. These powerful fentanyls and fentanyl analog laced counterfeit pills are being produced, as you have already heard, by illegal trafficking organizations, primarily in China, not exclusively, but primarily in China. And they reach the United States through both of our borders, both north and south. And we're constantly getting input from members of our committee by our federal partners, indicating that these drugs are coming in by land, by sea, and even through, as you have already heard, through the mail. They have told us that counterfeit drugs are extremely difficult to intercept since they hide amongst legitimate sources of medication, and their mask is either the real thing or perhaps a harmless drug. They see increasingly amounts of fentanyl-laced counterfeit opiates being seized at the border. They've been phenomenally successful in what they do, and they should deserve the credit that they're deserving of. But from what I understand, for every seizure that is made, there's 8 that get by. Now, I don't know where that statistic comes from, but the point of the matter is that there's a lot more flowing into the country that is being stopped from getting here. And that's when it becomes my problem. You know, your problem will always be more important than my problem because you have ownership of it. It's your problem. And this becomes a very real problem for local law enforcement. You know, you're going to hear from 2 distinguished individuals today, Steve Murphy and Javier Pina of the Netflix Narco fame. When I was a young detective and that case was going on, I read about it in the paper, watched about it on TV, I've seen the movie, I've read the book. But what was real to me when I was a young narcotics detective, when all that was going on in the 80s, is that cocaine that originated at the Medellin cartel in Colombia ended up on the streets of Owensboro, Daviess County, Kentucky, and people were suffering because of it. So it became my problem, and that's the issue here as I relate to you from a perspective of local law enforcement. Our officers find these drugs fentanyl-laced counterfeit drugs, and others everywhere. We find it in traffic stops. We find it at disturbance calls we go to. We certainly find it at drug busts we make, and unfortunately, at the scene of those individuals that tragically succumb to the drug. These counterfeit opioids pose a risk not only to public health, but also they undermine the efforts that we have in law enforcement in dealing with the opioid crisis. They also stretch our resources extremely thin. Law enforcement resources are already stretched to the limit, and this adds yet another dimension to that in terms of the time and the resources and the money that we have allocated to combat this problem. We're concerned about any increase of these dangerous drugs coming into our country and certainly into our communities.
Right.
I too want to make mention of the individuals that spoke just prior to us. They do put a face on this problem, but here's the reality, folks. As tragic and as heart-rending as their stories are, those stories are being replicated daily across our communities by people that you don't hear from today. In my home state alone, there were 1,565 individuals that lost their lives as a result of an opioid crisis in 2017. That was an all-time high. It was up from 11.5% the year before that, and they tell me the stats in 2018 will even exceed that. 52% of those individuals died as a result of fentanyl poisoning.
Well, thank you for that. That certainly puts a very strong local perspective on it. Want to kind of jump back to Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown. Talk to me about, from the micro level, on kind of what impact do you see those counterfeit opioids having on the opioid crisis, on overdoses? Talk to me about what you kind of are starting to see within DA.
The counterfeit pills are having a tremendous impact on the opioid crisis. Because there's such a demand in this country for opioid pills. You know, we hear the story about the progression from pill user to heroin user, and that is largely true. Most people who use heroin, the vast majority, start with a pill. But there is a large group of people who use pills outside of a medical purpose that never transition into heroin. The last survey of drug use in the United States, there are 475,000 people who admitted to be using heroin. There's 3.4 million who admitted to non-medical use, not to use at all, but to non-medical use of a prescription drug. So that is your target pool for the criminals that are making the counterfeits. And there is such a demand for these pills that exists. Now, I think we're starting, because we got great speakers like we're up before, to impact that demand. We're trying to push the demand down. But we've also pushed the supply down. In 2011, there were 17.6 billion, with a B, opioid pills prescribed in the United States. We've got that number down this year to 12.6 billion. We've reduced hydrocodone prescriptions in the United States by 42%. So but those successes also, again, we have supply going down, we have some demand going down, the supply is going down faster than demand. Who steps in? Drug dealers. Because it's money, and that's how they can make money. So the counterfeit opioids, the fentanyl, has changed everything. It is so lethal compared to the other opioids. Degrees of lethality more than, and you put those into the pills. Some of the people we heard talked about earlier, we refer to them as opioid naive victims. They're not habitual users of an opioid. They're the largest at-risk population because their bodies are not used to that level of opioid versus somebody that has a substance abuse disorder whose body is more tolerant of it. So it's this, super dangerous drug, demand, something that looks like something you get at CVS or Walgreens. It's this combination that makes the counterfeits unique and so dangerous. And they are a real problem and a growing problem.
Well, I appreciate your insights. Also, I think you highlighted the point that these drugs spread outside of just the substance abuse issue communities and starting to, as we've unfortunately also seen with our victim families, seep into the general population. Sheriff Cain, kind of want to briefly take it back to you. You talked quite a bit about fentanyl-laced opioids and what they do. Talk to me a little bit more in detail so folks understand what fentanyl and fentanyl-laced substances have done to your police operations, how it has changed the way your deputies, your sheriffs have to change the way they do their work.
You have to understand what I refer to as the nature of the beast. Fentanyl and fentanyl-laced analog drugs are in a class totally by themselves. Arguably, it's the most dangerous and most addictive and the most deadly medicine that this nation has ever known, bar none. You have to start with that, with that fact. Now, consider the individuals that are abusing it purposely, despite the risk, and you get an idea of just how addictive that drug really is. But you also have to figure into that the individuals that are using it unbeknownst to them, like the people that you heard about here today. People that should be alive today, should be enjoying their life like any 30-year-old individual ought to. Those people are gone, and they're gone because of this drug. The drug is so deadly that less than a milligram of it. Now, to put that in perspective, that's just a few grains of the table salt will kill an individual. Our officers that come in contact with this are at risk also, as are their canine companions. It's changed the scope of the way we handle law enforcement so dramatically that we've had to change certain policy and procedures. Establishing probable cause in a drug case, particularly from a patrol perspective, has always been field testing that drug to establish just exactly what that drug is. We've done that for as long as I've been a police officer. We no longer do it. And the reason we don't do it is because we don't allow those officers to handle those drugs out of fear of hurting or killing them. It's happened. So what do we do with those drugs? We send them to an already overburdened laboratory, and we get those results back sometime in such a timely fashion that we can prosecute those individuals. And unfortunately, many times we don't, and those people never see justice. I would be remiss if I didn't make mention of one of the positive things we're doing in terms of utilizing naloxone. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. It's a drug that reverses the effects of opioids. The National Sheriff's Association participated in a grant program wherein we have trained over 1,000 law enforcement officers across the nation. We provided naloxone kits to 39 law enforcement agencies in 21 states. Now, those are the numbers that I know. The numbers I don't are the lives that have been saved as a result of that. It's unfortunate that it's necessary, but it is the reality that we live with in law enforcement today.
Thank you. And thank you for obviously having that important naloxone program. That makes a difference. Executive Director Salter, wanted to kind of bring it back to you. You've worked many cases over your years at DA. You're involved in many cases now through HIDTA. Many of these counterfeit drugs are sold online by actors that claim to be Canadian but actually sit in China or sit somewhere else overseas. So they're online sellers, but they're not only online sellers, they're also foreign nationals. Talk to us a bit about the enforcement challenge that combination out of online and foreign brings you.
Well, it is a significant challenge. The dark web has changed the way that we do investigations because you have it accessible at your fingertips. You can sit at home and order fentanyl for anywhere from $12,000 to $20,000 a kilogram. I will say this: we've made huge strides in federal law enforcement, partnering with our state and locals with foreign counterparts in China and in Canada and Mexico. But it still comes down to you have people that there's 100,000% profit in fentanyl, 100,000% profit. I mean, who wouldn't want that kind of profit? And that's what these people are. That's what they see. They see an opportunity, as Keith mentioned. They have a target pool of people that want a pill. They want a pill that's going to make them feel better. It's actually, unfortunately, the same medicine, the counterfeit medicine that killed the family members that we heard about earlier. That's the high that these people want. That's what they're looking for. And so there's no quality control. Again, I said these are people making it with in garages in foreign parts of this world, and even in this country. A kilogram of fentanyl is, as I said, mentioned between $12,000 and $20,000. 1 kilogram will make 1 million 1 milligram pills, and if you sell that at $20 a pill, it's a $20 million gain from a small investment. That's what we're dealing with. That's what makes it so difficult.
About it. Those numbers are certainly simply staggering. So let's talk about kind of also the piece of, with all the challenges we already have with foreign actors, with websites, with a lot of the we already have come across the border. One of the topics we always hear discussed is importing additional drugs from other countries. I want to start with you, Sheriff Cain. The NSA has been at the forefront of this issue and has come out very strongly and consistently over the last 2 years on this proposed issue of importation. Can you talk to me about why the NSA felt strongly about taking their position, kind of what your thinking was and what you've done about it?
Sure. Well, I mean, we took the position on the basis of what you've heard here already today. But we heard it over and over again, but more so, we live it in our communities and we bear witness to it, unfortunately. But based on all of that information that we'd received, that we were aware of, in 2017, the National Sheriff's Association passed a resolution that states in part, and if you allow me to quote this, opposes drug importation legislation which jeopardizes law enforcement's ability to protect the public health and endangers the safety of law enforcement and other first responders. You've heard folks talk about today the assurances they have of going to what they call bricks and mortar pharmacies. Understand, folks, by creating the loopholes that importation legislation would create, that assurance goes away. Our concerns are shared, however, by other knowledgeable individuals on the national scene. Former FBI Director Louis Freeh studied this issue, and in his report, he had 3 key findings from the 2017 report. If you'll bear with me, I would like to read these to you. First, drug importation would increase the threat of illegitimate products, such as counterfeits, entering the United States. That in turn fuels criminal organizations' activities and profits. 2, drug importation proposals would worsen the opioid crisis, a crisis that has already grown substantially worse due to the powerful opioid, fentanyl and fentanyl analog-laced drugs. 3, already overburdened law enforcement and regulatory capacity would be unable to ensure a safe prescription drug supply under importation. And as telling as that is, similarly, a March 16, 2017 open letter to Congress from 4 of the most recent commissioners of the FDA. These are individuals that probably know more about this subject than any of us here. Here's what they had to say about it. 5 reasons for their opposition to drug importation. Serious risk to patients and consumers. Drugs purchased from foreign countries may be substandard, unsafe, adulterated, or faked. The FDA lacks the resources needed to oversee a major importation program. The global drug supply will limit improvement in access. And 5, any improved access and cost savings resulting from importation are likely to be minimal. Here's the fact, folks. We, as our nation's sheriffs and other law enforcement officers, we understand the debate. We understand and we get that we need cheaper prices for drugs for legitimate consumers. And we support an ongoing dialogue that will support some solution to that. But what is being proposed is creating a much larger problem in an attempt to solve the existing one.
Well, certainly I appreciate it. Thank you also for providing the rationale and detail. And thank you for taking the leadership. Other law enforcement associations, including the International Association of Chiefs of Police, major county sheriffs associations, and others have taken similar positions on it. So thank you for your leadership, and I know you're being joined by your colleagues. Executive Director Salter. Quick question, very focused on resources, because what Sheriff Cain just talked about, law enforcement resources are already pretty stretched, right? Like, it's not like there's a lot necessarily. So when you look towards something such as an importation that would increase the amount of goods coming in, increases the amount of work, so to speak, what does that do to all the law enforcement level, state, local, federal? Also, because at HIDTA, you kind of have that across view.
The impact on federal, state, and local drug law enforcement is significant because of the easeability of smuggling these counter narcotics into our country. Again, as small as a small package in the mail could have 20,000 dosage units of counterfeit medicine that's lethal, and as it impacts the community, oftentimes at HIDTA recently through the heroin response strategy, which has changed the opioid response strategy, and now is glad to report is the overdose response strategy. We partnered with public health. There was a partnership formed between public safety and public health, because oftentimes when you have an event where a number of overdoses occurred, we had it in Middle Georgia about 2 years ago. A number of people reported to the hospital overdosing. Public health contacted public safety, and that was really the first alert that public safety had. And we recognized that we had a real issue in this part of Georgia. It was a counterfeit Percocet. It was killing people, and we were able to, through our partnership with public health, reach out and do some alerts through social media that made it available to the rest of the citizens that were naive and not knowing what was going on in their own backyard. Why I say that is that's a different way of working in law enforcement, because we recognized that it was beyond what law enforcement could accomplish without partnering with our first responders and public health.
Oh, I appreciate that. Final words and final question to Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown. Kind of same question to you. Looking towards something where a world where people would consider, legalizing importation and increasing that flow of drugs. Talk to me about really the couple of aspects, which is the one you mentioned. Mail ports is one of the biggest issues to begin with, and then you're dealing with a lot of foreign actors all of a sudden that you didn't deal with before. What does that do to DEA's mission?
Well, that complicates it, because as the law currently stands, it's illegal to import an opioid into the United States if there is a sufficient domestic supply. And for the vast majority of opioids, there's plenty of domestic supply, so that we don't allow opioids to be imported unless there's a shortage and it's agreed upon by DEA and the FDA. Other drugs that are not opioids, not Schedule 1, Schedule 2, they are more market driven. They still have to have the FDA approve the drug, okay? We work very closely with the FDA on that. Now, unfortunately, for things like insulin and blood pressure medicine and so many other things, those are not controlled substances. They're drugs, but they're not controlled substances, and DEA has no purview over them. So that puts that burden on the FDA. But the counterfeit drug problem is you think of the commerce that flows into this country. You think of the packages and the shipments and the containers and how small, 20,000 pills is $500,000. 20,000 pills can go in a shoebox. And how many shoebox-sized packages arrive in the United States every single day of the week? FedEx, DHL, UPS, United States Postal. How many people drive across the northern border? How many people drive across the southern border? How many people arrive on cruise ships and other? It is overwhelming. And we're going to work at the border. We're going to try to stop it. But the only hope of success is to get people on the counterfeit side. Go to the pharmacy. Get it from doctors. Don't take it from anyone else. Eliminate, reduce addiction. And then the final answer, right, is fentanyl. And fentanyl is a game changer. And if we can continue to work with the Chinese government, we've had some success. Not all the success we want to have, but we've had some good success in eliminating and getting them to control fentanyl. Those are the pieces that it has to be. There's so many pieces to success on this. It's not, there is no miracle, just like there's no miracle pill for any of us. There's no miracle cure for this problem. It's such a multifaceted problem that it's you know, but it is solvable if we just work together and talk.
Well, I appreciate it. With that, we're going to wrap it up. Move on to the next panel, who will in detail examine what foreign actors, gangs, criminal cartels actually are doing to drive this further. We have experts that are going to come up on stage to be introduced. Please give a hand to the panel and thank them for their
Anything you need. Okay.
If I might begin our panel and ask everybody to keep the officers who were shot in Houston, Texas while serving a narcotics search warrant a few days ago in your thoughts and prayers until they leave the hospital successfully. I'd appreciate that. So it's my honor to be here today, and following these two panels were just excellent, and I think the synergy between the victims and our local law enforcement partners. And now what we want to do with the colleagues that are here on this panel is talk about the international piece. The previous panel did an excellent job talking about the havoc that these medicines wreak in the United States and the many challenges to enforcement. Let me provide a couple of statistics to kind of set the stage. The National Association Boards of Pharmacy does a survey every year looking at internet pharmacies that market medicines to patients in the United States. And what they tell us year in and year out is that 96% of all internet pharmacies in this practice are fraudulent. They don't comply with pharmacy laws. That's a pretty big percentage and makes it highly unlikely you can get a safe and efficacious medicine from that environment. The World Customs Organization tells us that counterfeit medicines comprise a $200 billion underground economy, with a B. To put that in perspective, heroin and cocaine sales combined on an annual basis are $160 billion. So I don't think people in general understand the magnitude of the issue, and we've got people here today that will highlight some of that. I think we know that in the beginning we looked at counterfeit lifestyle medicines like Viagra and Propecia as the problem. And I think people kind of grew numb to what it was. I don't think they paid the import to it that was appropriate. Fast forward, as we always know, my mom used to tell me, bad news doesn't get better with age. And what happened was, we went to sleep, we let it happen, and today we have traditional organized crime like the Camorra in Naples. We have the Sinaloa cartel that was begun by our friend Chapo, who is finishing up trial in New York. We have the MS-13, the most violent street gang in the history of America, all manufacturing and distributing counterfeit medicines in America. And again, it's not Viagra and Propecia. Now it's oncology, cancer, cardiology, HIV, respiratory, Hep C. I'm sure everybody in this room has been touched by Hep C with a friend. Finally there's a cure, and now the bad guys are making a counterfeit version. I've had friends who went through clinical trials for these Hep C medicines, suffered seriously as clinical trial patients. Now there's a cure, and now the bad guys are making it. And I think something that Keith said earlier, and he said it earlier in the day as well, and I want to touch on it, and Dan also touched on it. You know, as police officers, we all have families that are touched by addiction, that are touched by substance abuse. We're not immune. And I think Dan said it very eloquently. These drugs don't discriminate. So as police officers, we care too, and our families are touched. And so without going into it, we'll just assure you that we've all been impacted by this crisis. But I'll also tell you, and Keith also touched on this, you know, we went into this line of work and And the guys from Narcos will tell you, and you'll see it if you watch Narcos on Netflix, there's a passion in law enforcement. It's a passion that's kind of unbridled, except for maybe professional sports. Except you don't often get shot at in professional sports. But it's a passion that we all admire and respect in each other as a family. But when we talk about counterfeit medicines, it becomes personal. And Keith said that. But it becomes personal for another reason. My mom was a breast cancer survivor, and we were thrilled that she survived that. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, they know, pancreatic cancer. She got 5 months to live, and she lived 5 months. But she was comfortable, she was safe during that period, and it was thanks to the good medicine. But now, with the onslaught of counterfeit cancer medicines flooding the United States at deeply discounted prices, you know that if somebody dies of cancer, there's no autopsy. And there was no adverse event. There was no shocking symbol that said, oh my God, this person got a counterfeit medicine. No, they got a subtherapeutic dose. They died slowly of cancer. They should have survived. How many numbers are there? How many people have died from counterfeit medicines? We don't know. And that's the fear, right? So let me tell you, today we have a STEAM panel of real experts from the international arena. Don Bell from Canada, I'll ask each of them to give you some bio. Sam Lewis from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston. Javier Pena from DEA, 30 years, Netflix Narcos star. Of course, he's much better looking than the actor who portrays him, but we'll overlook that. And Steve Murphy, his partner, also 30 years with DEA, and another of the stars of Netflix Narcos. I would share with you on a personal note, when I volunteered to go to Mexico with DEA after Kiki going in and was kidnapped and murdered, which is part of Netflix Narcos Season 4, Mexico. That's when I met Stephen Javier, and that's when we started to understand the complexity, magnitude, and sophistication of drug trafficking cartels. Sinaloa, Guadalajara, Tijuana, and the violence. So with that said, Don, would you give us a brief introduction on your really impressive background?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As stated, my name is Don Bell. I'm from just outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I served 32 and a half years with the Ontario Provincial Police, which is equivalent to your state police. I retired as the Chief Superintendent, with oversight over our organized crime section, which included outlaw motorcycle gangs, provincial weapons, otherwise known as guns and gangs, auto theft, illegal gaming, proceeds of crime. After that, I ventured off over to the Canadian Border Service, which is our customs, where I served as the Director of Enforcement Intelligence for the Greater Toronto Area, specifically for the airport. And now I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Firearm Safety for the province of Ontario.
So thanks for being here, Don. Later on, I think he will help dispel some of the myths about the safety of internet pharmacy. Sam Lewis was, I think, the first and most progressive Assistant U.S. Attorney in healthcare fraud to really take on the drug trafficking cartels who were involved in counterfeiting prescription medicines for real serious therapeutic reasons. And Sam, if you could further explain your background, please.
Sure. For 21 years, from 1992 to 2013, I was a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of Texas, and also did a detail up here in Washington, D.C. From 99 to 2000, I've traveled extensively throughout the world, involving in investigations and training programs concerning counterfeit pharmaceuticals. I've been to Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Republic of Georgia, Ukraine, you name it, all with the goal of trying to combat and find out the best way to prevent counterfeit medicines from getting in the supply chain.
Thanks, Sam. And I think as Keith and Dan talked about the complexity, sophistication, violence of the international drug trafficking cartels, when they became part of this equation, it changed things in the U.S. And so I'll ask Javier Pena to just give us a brief background, and we'll talk more about Javier's experience. I will tell you now, because we do have limited time, but on Saturday evening at the Lincoln Theater in D.C., if you're interested at all, Steve and Javier will do their 2-hour show about chasing Pablo. And some of the stuff you read and see and hear from these guys, forget about watching TV. It's 2 hours that you'll never forget. And so there are tickets available, and I'm going to be there with my wife and son, actually. So if you're interested, it's a great 2 hours. Javier?
Thank you, Aaron. Javier Pena. I did 30 years with DEA, retired now. Before that, I was 7 years the Sheriff's Office in Laredo, so very familiar with the border area. Anyway, my career, Austin, Texas, 4 years, Colombia, 6 years, where Steve and I were involved in the Pablo Escobar investigation, After Colombia, Puerto Rico, 3 years, Puerto Rico, Washington, San Antonio. And I got promoted as the boss for the San Francisco Field Division. I know we have some San Francisco people here, great city. After San Francisco, I went to back to Puerto Rico, where I was the boss, and I covered the Caribbean countries, which, again, that's another border area, and we cannot forget about that. A lot of drugs coming through the Caribbean corridor. Then went back to Colombia as the #2 guy, did 3 years there. Then, like I said, and finally my last post was in Houston, Texas as the boss, so I had the border area, and interesting, right? A lot of good cases out of Houston, Texas. And I also want to add, we wear this pin for our fallen agent, Kike Camarena. A lot of y'all know the story. That's why we celebrate Red Ribbon Week. And just want to say I was involved. I was a brand new agent, had a year on. I was involved in the search for our agent, was in Mazatlan. And while we learned a lot, but like I said, we never forget, and that's why we do a tribute to our, to our agent, Kike Camarena.
That's right, Javi. So as Javier said, I also started as a policeman, and as did Steve. And Steve started in Tennessee, first assignment into the fire in Miami. Although he didn't find out that was just a small fire. Then he had to go to Colombia and work with Javier. So Steve, if you could share your background with us, please.
Yeah, and since he advertised our show, we'll just pay him up front. I'm Steve Murphy. I was a police officer for almost 38 years, the last 26 being with the Drug Enforcement Administration. My postings were Miami, Bogota, Colombia, North Carolina. Is that better? Thank you. Took me a while. Why are you giving me the finger back there? I got it. I'm a slow learner. North Carolina, then Atlanta twice, and Washington, D.C. twice. So I really don't know how to do anything else but be a cop. Luckily, I was teamed up with him for 3 years as a partner of Bogota, Colombia, and kind of rode his coattails, and it's worked out pretty good for retirement. So glad to be here with you.
So thank you, gentlemen. I think one of the myths that I'd like to kind of refute right out of the box, I'm sure everybody in this room has received an email from a Canadian online pharmacy. Now, of course, there's no assurance it's in Canada, and there's at least a 96% chance that it's not in Canada. But one of the questions, and we're so fortunate to have Don Bell here because we don't usually have that luxury. Don, let me ask you a question. If Steve's brother in Tennessee were to buy a medicine from, CanadaDrugs.dumbhead.com, can they get that medicine filled by a pharmacist in Canada?
No. In Canada, you have to receive, a U.S. doctor could not write a pharmacy that would be honored in Canada. In order to get a prescription filled at a legitimate pharmacy, it has to be written by a Canadian doctor.
So that's somewhat inconsistent with what we hear every day. The other thing that we hear a lot of is, well, why don't we just import medicines from Canada? And yet we know most of them come from Southeast Asia and other developing nations where corruption, collusion, and this sort of crime exists. So if these medicines are going to be transshipped through Canada, Don, into the United States, I think we all presuppose that Canada must have quite an infrastructure to receive, analyze, identify, quantitate these medicines before they're shipped to patients in the U.S. Is that how it works in Canada?
No, similar to what was stated earlier, we have 3 main postal services postal sites in Canada. So Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. So all the correspondence couriers that are coming through go through those sites. Obviously, like in the United States, it's a capacity issue. So items that are coming from other destinations, other origins, are not a priority. Our customs people are concerned primarily with what's going to be used for domestic use. If we're middling, for lack of a better term, something going to the United States, for instance, unless something's really flagged, it's not inspected. So it's been stated actually at government levels that it's not our duty to be the customs people for the United States and other countries. It's in fact the responsibility of the country that's the destinating point.
And just to clarify briefly, U.S. law enforcement and Canadian law enforcement have an incredibly tight relationship, and it's a brotherhood that is unquestioned. But there is a capacity issue, and I think it should go without saying that if they don't have an infrastructure to do that, nor a commitment to do that, then we shouldn't assume the medicines going through there are somehow being sanitized and qualified through some omnipotence. One of the issues that Dan and Keith brought up was international prosecutions and the difficulty in doing those things. And I think if Sam could just give us one example of, he's worked so many complex cases, but one example that really I think resonates with people is when he did go to China.
Right.
And then he did have the issue of trying to get that defendant back to the United States or prosecution and enforcement in a foreign land. So if you could share this with us, Sam.
Right. So if you're investigating individuals who are foreign nationals who are shipping counterfeit drugs to the United States that pose a problem. So there are three distinct ways in which you can address that. One, which I had the fortune of doing, is to actually travel to China and work jointly in a collaborative effort with the Chinese government, in which China law enforcement took down 11 nationals who were using labs there to manufacture, at that time, which was in 2005, lifestyle drugs, basically Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra, and sending that to the United States. And in looking at the pictures that were taken of those facilities, it was filthy, dirty. They were using road paint to make the drugs. They were using gypsum, which is drywall, to make the drugs. And so in the early days, it was the lifestyle drugs. But then it morphed into mainstream drugs. In 2010, we encountered an individual who operated, a guy by the name of Kevin Xu, who operated a generic pharmacy company supplying drugs to the Chinese government, but on the other hand, sending all sorts of drugs, Casodex, Plavix, Zyprexa, Lipitor, drugs that you use for regulation of blood thinners, all types of drugs he was manufacturing and sending to the United States and also the UK. We worked with our UK partners and found out that he was secreting those drugs in barrels that were marked as active ingredients, so they were never inspected, and then he was sending drugs to the US. So I worked with a large task force in Houston, Texas. That's where I was assigned. Worked with Department of Homeland Security, worked with FDA, worked with Postal Service, also DEA was involved with that. And we determined that with the magnitude of this individual, we needed a way in which to actually get him to the US, because we didn't want to risk having to deal with trying to work. We certainly didn't have a treaty with China, and so we were successful in what's called getting approval. It's a very complicated process to lure him to the United States, and he actually met with an undercover DHS agent and FDA agent. And during those meetings, this is what he said, which was so critical during the trial. He said, well, for cancer drugs, it doesn't matter, those people are going to die anyway. And so that's the mindset of the traffickers. So we were successful in indicting him and prosecuting. That's one avenue. Second avenue is to be able to work with another country who we have good relationships with to lure that person to another country. And that happened in connection with a second case. And the individual, I won't mention her name because I don't know if it's part of the public record, but anyway, we worked long and hard, 2.5 years, to investigate this person who was closely tied and aligned with the Chinese government. They were trafficking in counterfeit steel, counterfeit apparel, and counterfeit medicines. And working with attachés in various parts of the country, we first looked at luring this person to Australia. That was about to happen, and then all of a sudden we get a question, or we get a call, agents get a call and said, that's not going to happen. Don't tell us why, it just doesn't happen. So we next end up seeing what other country we have relationships, and just so happened we talked with our law enforcement partners in Bangkok, Thailand, and we were successful in luring that person there, obtaining her arrest. And while we were working on the extradition package, what happened? There was immense pressure put on by the government. The magistrate there held a hearing, unbeknownst to us, surprise to us, and gave her a bond. And she was ceremoniously put on the plane back to her country. So that's another avenue of trying to lure somebody. The third avenue is where you actually arrest, you seek an indictment, you arrest somebody, and then you ask that country to extradite them to the U.S. And with this third strategy, you have to look at the treaty between the United States and that country, and you look at the corresponding laws that actually criminalize that same conduct. So if in the U.S. the penalty is up to 10 years, depending upon the volume, the severity, and the risk to the public, and then you look at that country's laws, and if it's a misdemeanor, then you're limited in what accountability you can have, and also the ability to get that country to extradite the individual. So it can happen, but it's not always done because of different factors. But during the task force, we always looked at ways in which we could obtain information about that individual and then have that person travel to a country that we actually had good relations with and obtain their arrest. And I think in 2010, I was successful in arresting the very first person, Randy Gonzalez, who was extradited for intellectual property rights crime. So it's not easy, but it can be done.
So I think probably for most of you, it's the first time you've heard the complexities of just trying to put handcuffs on somebody. It's not that easy. We've got the proof, we've got the evidence, we've got the victims. We've got the right to do so. But you have to be half diplomat, half police officer, and there's probably a third half in there that doesn't make any sense in any way, shape, or form. That we have to jump through those hoops. You know, Sam mentioned the part about, well, they're going to die anyways. We have an ongoing criminal investigation with MS-13 currently in El Salvador, and the woman in charge of manufacturing the medicines that are being shipped to the United States is using medical school students from the university in San Salvador to manufacture the drugs. We have a cooperating individual who said to me about 6 months ago, you know, about 40% of MS-13's operating revenue comes from the sale of counterfeit medicines in the United States. 40%. So for those of you familiar with MS-13, have heard about MS-13, they make the Crips, the Bloods, the Hells Angels look like the minor leagues. And Javier will tell you how they are similar to Pablo Escobar in the violence. But what was interesting was he also said, he asked the woman in charge of manufacturing, do these medicines work? Because I'm selling them in the United States, I want to make sure I'm prepared and have a good answer when somebody says it's not working right. She says, mijo, we're making money, we're not making medicine. There's no active pharmaceutical ingredient. And that's what we're up against. So whether it's they're going to die anyways, or in many cases MS-13 and other cartels are preying on the Hispanic community for all of the various reasons you can imagine. So we have great vulnerability, whether it be a cancer patient or an immigrant who may not be fully ensconced in the language, the benefits, the insurance, the awareness. So with that said, we've talked about the violence and the cold, calculated behavior of drug traffickers. Javier, tell us about when you first started chasing Pablo Escobar and what it was you found really remarkable about him, and where did he start? What was he doing?
And before I start, let me just echo what Sam said. You know what? Our experience with DEA, one thing that all these traffickers all over the world, you know what the main thing they fear? Is coming to a jail cell in the United States. So anyway, with the extradition. Talking about Pablo Escobar, like I said, when Steve and I started, we learned, and we talk about Escobar because it's a lesson in history, how one person challenged this country and actually won. Pablo Escobar grew up poor. He grew up stealing hubcaps, headstones from grave, cemeteries, and they started doing 1 kilo, 2 kilos at a time, and before you knew it, because of the violence, his ingenuity, I hate to say that, but he was responsible for 80% of the cocaine that was reaching the world. How did he achieve this? Terrorism, narco-terrorism. That's why we call Escobar the inventor of narco-terrorism. In his reign of terror, 15 or 20,000 innocent people were killed by Pablo Escobar. We saw the invention of narco-terrorism, car bombs, putting bombs on commercial airlines, assassinations, bounties on police officers, $100 a hit. Can you believe that? Human life worth $100 a hit. Escobar killed thousands of people. Anyway, he rose to that. And you know, one thing that all these traffickers, and right now we're seeing that, you know, the Mexican traffickers, Colombian traffickers, traffickers in the Caribbean, their shipping, their distribution routes are intact. They're already established. They have the infrastructure. We're seeing the Mexican cartels now starting to ship counterfeit medication. We're seeing it. They have the people. They have the corruption in place. That's one of the factors that, like you said, that we were talking about. But again, because of the ruthlessness, these people don't care about human lives. All they want to do is, as long as they can make money, they're going to traffic in anything that's out there. And we're starting to see now the counterfeit drugs that are made for cancer, for HIV. I remember I grew up in the border, and back then, you know, a lot of poverty. So people would go into Mexico, to Laredo Cross, buy the prescription pills, bring them back. That was not working. We know now that was all counterfeit. The majority were counterfeit. We've talked with Shabbir about it, and it didn't work. So we need the safeguards, but these organizations, international, are already established in, like I said, heroin, cocaine. Now it's counterfeit medication.
So thank you, Javier. Let me ask Steve, when you look at the complexity and sophistication of organizations like Pablo Escobar's, is it surprising at all that they would add new products to their portfolio, whether it be cocaine to heroin or heroin to counterfeit medicines?
No, not at all. You know, these organizations, just like Keith said originally, and Javier just said again, this is all about making money, that period. If it costs lives, that's just the cost of doing business, right? So you're talking about somebody who, when we talk about Pablo Escobar, we're talking about a guy who was fighting extradition. That was his platform. Who ran for office in his country and was elected as an alternate congressman. Well, once he was elected, the congressman resigned, which put Pablo in his seat. And the reason he wanted that was because if you were a congressman in Colombia, you could not be extradited anywhere. You could not be arrested. So this is the kind of individual we're talking about. We're talking about a guy who implemented this business model where he was responsible for 80% of the cocaine in the world. And so, you know, they'd already dealt in marijuana, they had already dealt in the cocaine, and then as heroin was coming along. Well, the heroin problem in the United States was primarily coming from Southeast and Southwest Asia. So what did the Colombians do? They perfected Colombian heroin. And then they turned around where a kilo of Asian heroin might cost you $300,000 per kilo. They sold their Colombian heroin for $50,000 a kilo. Just cut the market right out from under everybody. We're talking about a man whose wealth was estimated at between $8 and $30 billion from drug trafficking. $1 billion, okay? This is not the United States making up statistics. This came from Forbes magazine, an internationally recognized financial magazine. And it wasn't just for 1 year, it was several years running where Pablo was rated as one of the richest people in the world. One thing we just enlightened Aaron with this morning that he didn't know is one of the years when they announced that, well, Pablo's son, Juan Pablo, called Forbes magazine. He said, no, you've got it completely wrong. He's worth a whole lot more money than $30 billion. So the truth is, we don't know how much the guy's really worth. But that's the amount of monies, I guess that's the carrot before the horse, that these people are willing to endanger all of us for their own personal gain.
And just to add a complication to something that Sam eloquently described, and I would ask Javier to recount what he was sharing yesterday. If the U.S., and we have great relations with law enforcement all over the world, and we always get cooperation, and it's really a great thing, honestly, to fly to a foreign country with your DA badge and your American flag and hand them a pin, and it's a cooperation that you just can't, I don't think we can really expect every time, but we get it, and it's great. But Javier, if a agency or a drug company comes to Colombia and says, listen, we've got this operation, they're doing this, that, and the other, making counterfeit medicines, what percentage of the Colombian National Police and military are dedicated to combating cocaine and narco terrorism, and how do they free up those resources?
Yeah. It's not a priority. Their priority, and I'm speaking for Colombia, that's my experience in right now, their priority right now is cocaine still at a height. They got the FARC, AUC, some of y'all who follow the Civil War, still going on. If you follow Venezuela, a lot of Venezuelans are coming into Colombia right now. That's not their priority. It's got to be on it'll work, but you got to do it on a personal basis. Captain, I need a favor. We got this, and you pretty much put it in a little, gift box. It's already done. I need some help here. They'll do it, but like I said, their priority right now is the major cocaine organizations still in Colombia, and the FARC and the AUC.
And I think that's one of the things we have to always keep in mind. We can go ask for help, but when you go to a Colombia or the Mexico, they're dealing with the cartels, they're dealing with the HIDTAs, which are like the AUC in Colombia. The violence is beyond compare. Mexico is now the most dangerous country in the Western Hemisphere for travel and kidnapping. And now you want them to go out and do a counterfeit pill case. Probably unlikely. Now, as Javier said, we spend a lot of time doing our own investigations. We collect all the evidence. We do the chemical analysis. We put it together in a package. We give it to Homeland Security. We've got the indictment. In that case, if you go to a captain in Bogota and show them what they have, and all they have to do really is kick a door and put handcuffs on somebody, they're great at that. And we should not expect much more than that, considering what they're dealing with. Don, let me ask you, in summary, is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation?
I have to echo the thought or the comments made earlier. We just recently did an investigation, a Hells Angels investigation, which tracked the fentanyl going up from Toronto to Montreal and then into Connecticut. And on the wiretap, it was revealed that basically the acceptance of loss of life, not a problem. It's all about the money. So that's the driving force behind everything. It's organized crime, low risk, high profit.
And you know what, I think it's interesting you share that, Don, and I appreciate you doing so, because I think we typically look at Canada as where the false flag flies on internet websites. Nothing really happens there. But in fact, you have your own fentanyl issues, not just domestically, but that product's also coming south in the United States. So we do have two borders in the United States, and both of them are permeable, and we need to focus on both of them. And for those of you, I know my partners here from DEA, Canada has great police forces and police resources. But it's a tough issue, and those borders are long and porous. Sam, is there anything you'd like to add?
If you have questions or discussions about internet pharmacies and what are we doing about internet pharmacies, and I've heard it described as like whack-a-mole. So every year, identify internet pharmacies that are sending counterfeit drugs, are suspected of sending counterfeit drugs, and the U.S. looks at it and determines which ones have connections here where they can shut it down. And as soon as those sites go down, there's others that mushroom right back up. And so I guess the moral of the story is online pharmacies, unless they're connected to a brick and mortar, they are risky. So if it's an educational tool piece, unless it's tied to an online unless it's tied to a brick and mortar, don't tell people don't put your life at risk. I recall early on when we were looking at drugs coming in, the lifestyle drugs, and we would have emails and communications, and we would actually then do a search warrant. We could see where those packages went, and you go knock on somebody's door, they go knock on the door and said quietly, "Can I talk to you outside?" Because they were getting lifestyle drugs. They didn't want their, if you know where they were getting from. And then they'd have to tell them, "Look, you still have some of this left. If you do, you need to get rid of it," and tell them what's in it, gypsum and drywall. You just see the fear in their eyes. So just be aware of these online pharmacies.
And I think it's what he's saying is really important, and just to say it slightly differently, that is, if there were a simple problem, maybe a simple solution would work. But so far, all we have is a simple solution for a very complex problem. And we have these networks out there that may have 10, 15,000 affiliate pharmacies working for them. We've bought medicines where it's a Canadian internet pharmacy, because it must be, it has a Canadian flag on the website, yet the money goes to Russia, the drugs come from India, none of it's approved, and we can't get anything out of that. And yet the patient is now sitting with a COPD medicine that doesn't work. Now I'm told by COPD patients that when you have an episode with COPD, it's like trying to breathe through a cocktail straw. So I have a little issue with claustrophobia, so I know what it is to be sucking air in a tight space, and we don't want that. But you're going to probably live. But when we talk about cancer and HIV and Hep C, these are very serious issues. And I don't think we can underestimate the violence associated with these complex organizations that are now in this space. Javier, anything you'd like to add?
And it's a little off. Just guys, if you all are in your communities, I always tell people where I speak at, if you see the synthetic marijuana still out there, complain to someone. That's killing people. In fact, we talked to someone who's got a friend, right, smoked a joint. I mean, I saw it in Houston, and in Houston, you know how they make it? They mix them in cement mixers. They bring in the cannabinoid from China. They put barley in like cement, then they package it. So about 20 or 30 of those packages are going to be 95%, and that's what's killing the young people. It's against the law, but it just what I mean. We had a hard time with Congress, trying to change the law. DEA, are we still seeing it? I hope not. We are. wow, guys complain. You citizens out there in your communities, if you see it in usually it's the service stations, you know, they're packaged in Scooby-Doo, all sorts of colorful packages. Complain to someone, because that's killing and hurting young people.
Thanks, Javier. I'll just ask Steve maybe to bring us home and talk about, Steve is very passionate about how these drugs don't discriminate, and we all are at risk. And there are faith-based and other public service ways to get the word out to the people who are not in this room today.
Yeah, and don't think that this is not an issue that doesn't touch everybody in here, either directly or indirectly, whether it's your family or a friend. If you think it doesn't, you need to take a closer look. It amazes me when I hear that there are people that still believe there's no problem with counterfeit medications coming into this country. You know, my gosh, if you heard firsthand today from some victims, from Rick, the victim, and the victims' families, what happened, and these are not recreational drugs. These are people that just pulled their back. My wife pulled her back last night. You know, I'm trying to give her Advil. This could reach out and touch any of us. They're not even taking full dosage units. They took a quarter of a Xanax or whatever it was, and that's an overdose death. So this is not something, you know, that we can't look at DEA and say, guys, this is your problem, go fix it. You can't look at our legislators and say, you go legislate us out of this problem. This is a community-wide problem throughout the entire United States where everybody has to get involved. So, you know, if nothing else, I hope we at least opened your eyes today and brought attention to this issue, and you know, hopefully you'll pay attention to it as you go through your careers and affect it positively as any way you can.
Thanks, Steve. If we could have one call of action, that's for everybody in this room to tell one person what you heard today. Because I'm sure before listening to our first panel today, you might not have thought twice if somebody said, if you said, oh, it hurt my back, says, oh, take this, this is what I use. How many people in here, honestly, you don't have to raise your hand, but thought, I might die if I take that? And y'all are in this room, and you might have been in the last room, and you're already engaged in this issue. So for those people out there who are not, I promise you, they're not thinking about it. And I live in Fairfield, Connecticut. It's a small town. Most people commute to New York. You don't think much of this issue. I have a 25-year-old daughter who's lost 2 friends to fentanyl at 24 years old. We shouldn't be burying those kids at that age. So with that said, the panel will take questions in the hallway or afterwards. We won't do it from here, but I really want to thank the Partnership for Safe Medicines and Shabbir and all of you who came, and especially the first panel. I don't know how y'all tell that story. I can't talk about my daughter's friends without being emotional, but it's, you know, we've all been touched by this. And so thank you all very much for your time and for coming today.
I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. It was a real pleasure to see so many people at this briefing. My name is Marv Shepard. I'm currently the president of the board of directors for the Partnership of Safe Medicines. I was one of the founding fathers of this organization 16 years ago, and my life with counterfeit drugs has started as a researcher, being a former professor at the University of Texas. I was following counterfeit drugs coming across the border from Mexico in the early 1990s, and I followed them for all that time and still do till today, and will continue to do them on both borders. I do a lot of research in that regard. And in the last hour and a half, we have given you an overview of the challenges of counterfeit drugs. And you may think we've talked a lot about fentanyl, but I'll remind you, 19 of the top 20 drugs sold in the United States have found to be counterfeit. They found counterfeit versions of 19 of the top 20. So they're across all therapeutic categories, not just the opioids. They cross all of them. And some of them, the counterfeits, no active ingredient in them at all. None. About a third of them, there's no active ingredient in these counterfeits. They're just taking your money. Greed. Just give me your credit card number and off I go. That's all they care about. So they're unsafe, and we need to put a stop to it. law enforcement, we heard a lot of today, it's got to put a stop to it. But you, the community, can put a stop to it by telling people, don't take that person's drugs. Be safe with them. Go to a U.S. pharmacy and pick them up that way. The last thing I want to talk about the fentanyl problem, a lot of fentanyl is being made in the United States. They busted a big lab in San Antonio and Houston, huge lab. They provided over 800,000 fentanyl lace tablets in the lab out of San Antonio. It was at the University of San Antonio, the University of Texas at San Antonio, in one of the houses close to campus. It was a major bust for that lab. They just broke another one in Utah. Shabbir gave me that information, a huge lab that was connected to a mob group across the United States that was made. The presses that they're making these from come from China. You can buy a tablet press for less than $200. And you can buy the dyes, the molds that the press features that counterfeit Xanax, oxycodone, you name it, out of China. Put them in the machine, pour the powder in them, and let them go for $200. And they caught a guy in California with one of the presses in the back of his SUV with all the powders and everything to make the counterfeit drugs. It's fascinating how the underground works and these people work. So it's coming in from other countries, and it's also being made here by some thugs, and I use the word kindly, thugs in this case, okay? Please visit our website, www.safemedicines.org. It's a super website. You'll find all the information you can demand, and you can order printed material to pass out to briefings or talks you're giving anytime. Friends, please visit it, and you can get all the information you want, and we'll send you in boxes. If you want 500 of them, we'll send them to you. And in that information, we have done a pretty good job of looking at the counterfeits by state, by state, by state. So you can get Virginia or Washington or Texas, whatever you want, and look at the counterfeit endorsement in cases involved in those states. We are currently working with patient allies to assemble a joint letter about the dangers of breaking our secure supply chain. Our secure supply chain is the United States closed supply chain, which we like to keep it that way, closed. That's why we have such a secure system here. It's not allowing drugs to flow in outside of the United States. It's pretty secure. So if you'd like to sign our letter, please get on our website, and you can find all the information on the front page of our website. Personally, I want to thank you all for coming. It's been a good time, very emotional, very factual, and to the truth. Thank you. Have a good day.